In this video, I'll be discussing Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and we'll continue our discussion of Volume 1. The chapters are 4 through 7. So in Chapter 3, we saw Victor complete his creation of the monster. In Chapter 4 is when he actually brings him to life and his reaction to that. It's important to note just the description, the physical description of the monster, because it has, in our minds, there's a certain vision of Frankenstein that we're probably most used to based off of like the Boris Karloff old film. But he's described in Shelley's novel a little bit different than how he usually how he's usually sort of represented. On page 85 here, there's the description of the creature. So he's basically 8 feet tall, described as proportionately large. So his features, his arms, his legs are larger than normal. So he's of a gigantic stature. His eye color is described as sort of yellowish skin. And he says his yellow skin scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath. So his body's almost sort of barely held together. So the large scars are kind of an important part because he's sort of been pieced together by different parts of bodies that Victor has sourced from the cemetery. His hair is an interesting one. So in the Shelley novel, his hair is luxurious or lustrous black and flowing. So he actually has long hair, more like the illustration picture of him. Long flowing hair, his teeth of a pearly whiteness, and his watery yellowish eyes. He has a shriveled complexion and straight black lips. So he's very ugly, basically, is what Shelley is describing. And it's his ugliness that will be the source of how society reacts to him. His ugliness is the source of the prejudice that he will experience. So even though we don't know this yet, but the human society will react to the creature based solely on the superficial appearance of his ugliness and not look at his actions or beliefs or feelings. They just judge him for his appearance. As we move further into the novel, the other characteristics of the monster will be shown, and we'll learn that, when he's created, he can't speak fully yet, and he speaks only in inarticulate sounds, but he'll eventually gain the power of language. He also has some other superhuman qualities, super speed, strength. He's more agile than the normal human being. And he can sustain more extremes of heat and cold and can subsist on a very meager diet. So he's sort of superhuman in a way, but also subhuman in a way, right? He's got superpowers in some regards, but he's also viewed as unhuman or subhuman in how society perceives him based on his appearance. So there's this idea of prejudice based on this creature, the monster that Victor creates, that he doesn't quite fit into human society, and whether he's, a separate species or not, Victor sort of sees him as a creation, a new creation, a new type of being. So continuing on with Chapter 4, Victor's first reaction to the creature, almost immediately he, this whole time he's been sort of obsessed with doing this, with bringing life to this creature that he made. And then almost immediately after he sees it come to life, he rejects it. He says, I had now finished the beauty of the dream, or I had desired it with an ardor that far exceeded moderation. But now that I had finished, the beauty of the dream vanished, and breathless horror and disgust filled my heart. Unable to endure the aspect of the being I had created, I rushed out of the room and continued a long time traversing my bedchamber, unable to compose my mind to sleep. So he's immediately sort of disgusted with the creature that he created once it's alive. And, it racks his brain. He's disappointed in what he created. And he sees it as ugly and almost demonic because of its appearance. And he immediately leaves the room, tries to sleep, but is again tortured with nightmares and agitated. So he leaves his apartment, abandons the creature in his apartment, leaving it there, and he says he spent the night in the courtyard instead of staying in the same apartment with the creature. And he passed the night in the outside of the apartment. So he's, again, completely rejected his creation and views it as, a disappointment and a sickening thing that he's sick with himself as well, that he did this. And he now refers to it as a monster. You might also note that the feverish dream that Victor has is sort of symbolic, or maybe foreshadowing or flashbacks to his mother's death. On page 85, he says, so this is when he created the monster, and then he immediately hates what he created and runs off to his bedroom, tries to sleep, and then is facing nightmares all night. He says, it was in vain. I slept indeed, but I was disturbed by the wildest dreams. I thought I saw Elizabeth in the bloom of health, walking in the streets of Ingolstadt. Delighted and surprised, I embraced her, but as I imprinted the first kiss on her lips, they became livid with the hue of death. Her features appeared to change, and I thought that I held the corpse of my dead mother in my arms. A shroud enveloped her form, and I saw the grave worms crawling in the folds of the flannel. So he's, a lot of symbolism there with the women in his life being dead, his mother's death, and this idea that Elizabeth is somehow tied into the creature's birth. But in a way, Victor has done something that, his hyper masculinity, or his toxic masculinity, he has become a man who has given birth in a very unnatural way. And it's a kind of death of women that's also embedded in his creation. He initially created the monster as a way to sort of symbolically resurrect his mother, who died when he was 17. And he, again, grieves her and it broke up their family. Elizabeth sort of stepped in as the maternal role in the family when the mother died. And Victor is also promised to marry Elizabeth in the future. But he instead, created this monster. So it's sort of like he was motivated by grief and his own ambitions, and this is the result, some horrible creature. Another key theme of this moment, I'm really focusing on chapter 4 here, but the theme of abandonment will become relevant to this chapter, as well as when we learn what the creature experienced from his perspective. But Victor is a kind of parent in his weird way, as being the creator of this monster. And the novel begs us to question what role Victor has as the creator. What are his responsibilities to his creation? And more generally, what obligations do parents or creators have to their offspring or children? So while Victor abandoned his apartment, it turns out that his old friend Henry Clerval is in Ingolstadt, and he sees that Victor is very sickly and needs his help. So Victor and Henry reunite, and Henry helps him heal from some of the trauma that he just experienced in his creation of this monster. Victor's obsession with his experiment has, taken him to a very sick place, both mentally and physically. He suffers from anxiety and nightmares. He kind of has PTSD in a way. He has this nervous anxiety, nightmares, and he looks pale and sickly. So Henry, as a friend, sees that Victor needs his help and helps Victor renew a sense of peace somewhat in his state of being. And he does this by exposing Victor to more natural elements of the world. So they go out into nature, and it becomes a kind of healing source that helps Victor feel better mentally and physically. So there is this kind of another theme of nature versus the unnatural. Nature being the natural, Mother Nature, the world around us, natural processes of birth and reproduction, and the unnatural being Victor's man-made scientific experiments where he tried to control or conquer nature, and the result is something monstrous. So nature versus the unnatural becomes a kind of central theme as well, and part of Victor's healing process. Friendship is also another theme that you could bring in here, like the connections, the social connections that Victor has that bring him health and happiness. Having friends, having family, it becomes a part of a healthy life for Victor. And when he's separated from his family or separated from his friends, that's when he becomes more withdrawn, isolated, and his mental and physical health suffer. So the more connected he is to people and society and the natural world, the healthier he becomes physically and mentally. So in chapter 5 through 7, the action sort of revolves around one of the minor characters, and we see in letters that Elizabeth has written to Victor information about this backstory of this character named Justine Moritz, and she becomes a kind of minor character that further progresses the plot revolving this idea of revenge. But a little bit about Justine. So she is born and her mother rejects her. She just is unliked by her mother. And then she's adopted by Elizabeth's aunt's family, where she sort of works as a servant, but she's very favored and treated kindly. It's also important to note her beauty. There's a contrast between characters who are ugly and characters who are beautiful, and those who are beautiful are often viewed as moral or ethical characters or innocent. And then eventually her aunt dies and her mother also dies, making Justine sort of orphaned in a way. So she comes to live with Elizabeth and Victor's family, where she becomes a kind of servant and caretaker for the youngest boy, William, so Victor's youngest brother. And basically, this is over 2 years' time, while Victor and Henry are off, gallivanting in nature, and life goes on in Geneva with Victor or with Victor's father and their family. And then in a letter from Elizabeth, we see horrible news. This is on chapter 6. William is dead. So the youngest brother of Victor has been killed. He's been murdered. And the evidence is the murderer's fingerprints were still, like, bruises on his neck. So he's been strangled to death. And as it turns out, Justine, the character of Justine, is framed for the murder. She is the sort of caretaker for William, and she is blamed for William's death. So hearing that Victor's youngest brother has been killed, Victor and Henry return back to Geneva. This is the first time that Victor has come home since he first left to go to university. And during a lightning storm, he sees a flash of lightning illuminating the shape of the creature, and immediately he knows that the real murderer is in fact his creature, the monster that he created. And he's now fully aware that he says, "I had turned loose into the world a depraved wretch whose delight was in carnage and misery. Had he not murdered my brother?" So he becomes, again, a light bulb moment for him that, oh, Justine was not the murderer. It's actually this creature that I created that is wreaking carnage on my loved ones. So Justine, as it turns out, has been framed with the murder of William, and it's the monster who committed the murder. And he does so by planting a picture of Victor's mother, William's mother, the necklace on Justine. So she is viewed as, being jealous of this piece of jewelry, and she took it from William and killed him. And then this is enough evidence. Again, wasn't a lot of DNA evidence or, it was all sort of circumstantial evidence. But she's condemned to die because she has been framed with the death of William. So these are the first victims of the creature: William, the young little boy, Victor's youngest brother, and then the innocent Justine Moritz, who is framed as the murderer. So now Victor feels the guilt that it was really his fault, or he feels that, it's his actions that have brought about these deaths in his family and in society. So now he bears the mental and physical tolls of guilt as well. So a couple things to note here. The vengeful acts that the creature committed to spite Victor are symbolic. He targets people, in this case William and Justine, because they represent innocence, beauty. William is a young, beautiful child, and Justine is a beautiful young woman. Both symbolize a kind of innocence that the creature has lost in himself, and we'll learn more about that in volume 2. They also represent a larger idea, well, loss of innocence being one of them, but the other idea is that, society is so quick to judge. They are easily swayed to believe that Justine is a murderer based on very little evidence. And they almost immediately in the trial sentence her to death. So there is this almost like bloodlust or hatred, darkness in human society that is exposed by Justine's death. And it also is revealing of Victor himself. And I again refer to him as sort of a toxic person, but he doesn't come forward. He had this chance to stand up for the innocence of Justine and come forward and say, I don't think it was her. It was actually this monster that I created. But he sort of dismisses the importance of his story. He says, 1,000 times rather would I have confessed myself guilty of the crime ascribed to Justine, but I was absent when it was committed, and such a declaration would have been considered as the ravings of a madman. I would not have exculpated her who suffered through me. So he sort of dismisses this idea that, if he did come forward, he would just be considered a lunatic or a madman for talking about, the creature as being the true murderer. So he really undermines his own guilt in a way, even though he says he feels guilty. He doesn't do anything about it. He could have also confessed to Elizabeth what happened, but he doesn't. Elizabeth suffers because she believes in Justine's innocence, and she is the only one to stand, who comes forward in the trial against Justine and talks about the innocence of this person. So she tries to stand up for what's right. But Victor kind of just takes this, sort of self-protective view of himself and his own guilt. He feels it internally, but he doesn't ever sort of publicly make it clear to others that he is the guilty one. So he's very sort of protective of himself, even though he does acknowledge that he feels himself as the true murderer. So yeah, he's he also bears guilt, but he doesn't come forward to admit his guilt at this point. He just suffers in silence. So basically at the end of volume 1, we have our first look at victims. William and Justine are the first victims of the creature, and this has all been let loose from Victor's actions, his experiment that went wrong, and his ambition and drive to conquer nature and to overcome death by creating a new life in this very unnatural way. And innocence is kind of what is lost in Victor and in the creature and in society as well. The innocent lives are taken, of Justine and William. So there is a sense of loss of innocence in this volume 1 of the narrative.